All right, welcome to the introductory lecture for CVSP 203. I'm Dr. Fugate. I teach in the philosophy department and the CVSP department, and it's a pleasure for me to give you this introductory lecture. Let me start by just bringing your attention to this, down here at the bottom. This is not just for me. I put this up here. For all lectures, please make sure that you turn off your cell phones and that you give your utmost respect and attention to the speakers. Sometimes the speakers come from other parts, not from CVSP. They're doing this voluntarily. No one's forcing them to do it. They're doing it for your benefit. So sometimes if we don't show them the most respect that we can, that doesn't look so great for us in CVSP. So please do that. A few things before I get started on the actual content of the introduction section. So this course actually, it has a section called Introduction in which you will possibly read three texts, Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, an extract from a text by Giordano Bruno that is a commentary and a reflection on Copernicus's work, and a poem called An Essay on Man by Alexander Pope, which comes from a bit later in the period that we're going to discuss, but in certain sense encapsulates the further developments of the ideas that you'll see in the other two texts, hopefully. So that's what we do in the introductory section. But before I go into that in any detail, I just want to say a little bit about this course. This course is now in its, third or fourth, maybe fifth version of a new kind of design of CVSP 203. Part of that new design is that you have a reader that all of these texts are found in. And I just wanted to say a few words about this reader. First of all, you can purchase it it should be available in the bookstore, and it collects together all of the texts into a number of sections, right, under a general theme. The theme of the introduction is introduction. And then we have the scientific revolution and political theory and so on, different sections in this course. Now, in each section, you will find a number of texts. This is very different from other CVSP courses you've taken. If you took 201 or 202, you read texts one after another, and you generally had a common lecture that dealt with one or a couple of texts together. In 203, we've grouped the texts into discussions. So the introduction are all supposed to be texts that when you read them give you different points of view on similar themes. So part of the design of this course in the readings themselves is to show you the complexity of interpreting the period in question and the texts involved. To show you that under themes like, or just under terms like reason, there are vastly different views of what that might mean, many of which take what another person says to be reason to be the exact opposite of reason. Or enlightenment. Many of you have heard the term enlightenment. You probably recognize this as one of the key concepts you'll talk about in this course. But when you get to reading the texts in the section that we have on enlightenment here, you'll find enlightenment defined in different and even vastly opposed ways. People consciously saying, this is enlightenment, knowing that someone else said that something else was enlightenment. And so that's part of what these blocks and the arrangement of the texts within the blocks are supposed to bring out for you, and I hope they do that. Another aspect, and that's in terms of diversity of viewpoints, is that many of these sections try to select texts from different traditions within the modern period, which we're discussing. So texts by French writers, German writers, British writers, Italian writers, because they're, particularly in the modern period, we'll see, the location in which one is working, the language in which one is writing, greatly affects the viewpoints that they will express. So, for instance, when we do talk about in that Enlightenment section, you all have heard of the French Enlightenment, and you'll understand that in the French Enlightenment, the church is seen as a very oppressive force, and so a lot of Enlightenment discussion is about science and secularism, and often even atheism, and seeing religion as almost an enemy in many cases. Whereas when we read Kant in the Enlightenment section, he's a German writer, he's living in a Protestant region, he sees freedom of religion as central to enlightenment. He sees the value of enlightenment largely in the ability it allows people to have freedom to be religious. So he says the key point of enlightenment lies in religion. This is very different, right? But it reflects the diversity of standpoints, which is grounded in the diversity of the regions in which they lived. So that's another thing that we've tried to work into the reader for you. So if you look under here, we have tried to increase diversity in terms of kinds of texts also. There is in this, you'll start out reading this course not reading a philosophical text or a literary text, but reading a scientific text and trying to extract from that scientific text, Copernicus's great work on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, trying to extract from it what it might mean to the people of the time, what it might have meant in terms of human significance, right? How did it change views that people had about themselves in the period? But this is a special task, right? Reading a text that doesn't tell you on the surface what it means, but rather presenting you in a lot of scientific jargon and mathematics and other things, a new scientific theory, and you have to read that with a sense of what that might mean, right? And so that's another aspect of this. We have poetry and drama, and we tried to have as many different genres of writing as we possibly can have in this. So you'll read plays, Shakespeare, you'll read poetry, Pope's Essay on Man, you'll read dialogues and scientific texts as well, and philosophical treatises. Okay, so let me say just a little bit about what this course is. Many of you took this and you saw it was the making of the modern world. What did you think that meant? Anyone? Do you know what the modern world is? Did you think it meant today, maybe? What? The what? States, countries. That is in part true, yes. The origin of modern nation states and how the ideas, the philosophical and cultural ideas came together to form those. That is absolutely true. Really, when we say the making of the modern world, that's not the greatest title for this course because we're talking about really the making of modern European civilization. The modernity generally describes the period from, say, 1650 to the 1840s, right? This is what is often described in different fields as the modern period. If you study modern philosophy, that ends around 1800 and starts in about 1650. So the word modern may make you think contemporary, but for us it means this period, and we're gonna study essentially the period from 1600 until 1830, 1840, around there. So actually, Copernicus's text is in 1543 it was published. That's the first text we'll read, and the last texts we'll read are from the 1830s, right? Hegel and Goethe and others. So really this is a course more or less in European intellectual history during the 16th until the early 19th centuries, right? Often called the modern period. So we limit ourselves to Europe, more or less. We ignore almost entirely the developments in North America and elsewhere. You might see them mentioned in one of the later texts by a guy named Condorcet. Now, this is a map. Here you see a map of Europe in 1600. What is interesting, or one of the things that you'll see about this period, it's a period of total revolution and change over this couple of hundred years in Europe. It goes from a world that is dominated by the Catholic Church and by medieval traditions in Europe and by kingdoms, and I'll talk a lot more about this, but it goes from this to more or less a modernized nation-state-based world in Europe. And so you can see this reflected in, for instance, in the map of the period. In 1600, at the beginning, of course, Copernicus, I said, is 1543, so even a little bit earlier. Many of the nations that we recognize today in Europe did not exist, right? It doesn't make any sense to speak of someone as Italian, except that they spoke maybe some version of the Italian language. But that was not what determined one's political situation whatsoever. It was determined by local princes, kings, in a vastly complicated and contentious structure. So you can see France looks stable, here, large and normal. You're kind of happy to see that. But if you actually look at this map from year to year, you would find France almost vanishing in some weeks and coming back, and England expanding down, and all of these little, it's almost like a fractal there in the middle, right? That's what we now, Austria and Germany and all this. Every region was ruled by a different local authority. And what was called, you've all heard of the Holy Roman Empire, right? That controlled mainly this large area where you see all these little pieces, what is now Germany and Austria and whatnot. But that was just a coalition under a fairly weak, non-Roman, not much of an emperor either. And so if you lived in one of these jurisdictions, what the official religion was, what the official laws were generally determined by the local authorities. All right, so this was, and these changed. How did you get more power? How did power change? How did laws change? They changed by revolutions, by fighting, constant year-to-year fighting. These little regions would disappear and come back and expand. And Sweden would come down and sweep all the way down into Europe, and then be kicked back out, and so on and so forth. So from 1700 until 1830, it's just a constant destabilization of these states in Europe. And you'll see this reflected in the text, because some of the key questions is I'll talk about today about system order, how things become stabilized, what the best order is, what is the authority, what is the basis of political authority. In a situation like this, these are the central questions to how you live your life, right? If someone has something to say and says that political authority should not be based upon the right of someone who is more powerful than you, who simply takes you over, but should be based in human rights or something, this is going to speak to you in this period. So this is kind of geographically the contents of our course. Now, what I'm going to do in the next part of my lecture here is give you a kind of snapshot, go into and tell you a little bit more about Europe prior to and around 1600, and then switch to speaking about it after the period in question. The idea being that by comparing the two, you'll see the kinds of battles that were waged philosophically, scientifically, culturally, to change the world from the pre-modern version of Europe into the modern world, and thus we see the making of the modern world. One thing before I get started here is to say this is, of course, vastly oversimplified. Right? Everything here I'm going to say is three quarters false, but in another respect, it really hones in on some of the things and themes that you'll see over and over again. On the other hand, some of the things I say will almost be unbelievable, that Europe was like this only 200 years prior, and that's something to keep in mind. So externally, if you think about Europe externally, its external relations, by 1600, it had been almost 100 years since the discovery of the Americas. So the modern period is not really the period of discovery. It's a period that is reflecting back upon the discovery of the Americas. It's the time of the real exploitation of the Americas, is what's going on at this period. So it's not discovery any longer, although many figures, Bacon and others, will use the image of discovery over and over again in your courses or in your texts to, map out what the future should be like, right? But it's been nearly 100 years since the circumnavigation of the globe, and it was 1533 that the Aztecs and the Incas were conquered and more or less destroyed by Spain. Some of the horrors of this age, as you will see in some of the texts, you'll get hints in Condorcet later in the course. He'll reflect back on the horrors of this period, right? The exploitation. Bruno, in his text, compares his own revolution, which is supposed to be humanistic, to the horrors of Columbus and of the previous age. So the slave trade is just getting going in 1600. By 1700, Europe will hold between 6 and 12 million slaves worldwide. And part of what came from that that exploitation of North and South America was, of course, the gain of gold and silver, which were often traded to China and other countries for weaponry. And this is what fuels a lot of, I told you the map changes drastically because of all these wars. And what fueled these wars between France and Spain and all these small city-states was the money that they were getting from North America. Also religious issues, but both. So that is kind of the external relationship of Europe in 1600. Socially and politically, until the Protestant Reformation initiated in about 1517 by Martin Luther, the Catholic Church was the only kind of pan-European institution. Right? It was the only institution that everyone had to respect pretty much throughout all of Europe. All kings, there was no one kingdom of Europe, there was no one nation, no European Union, but there was, in another sense, one unity in terms of the hold of the Catholic Church, which was even more powerful than individual kings, right? It largely determined both the political and social and intellectual life of the people. It had the authority to condemn and punish unorthodox scientific, philosophical, or religious doctrines. And to what extent it did depended on how lucky you were and where you lived and who your friends were, whether they persecuted you or not, right? All major universities were Catholic universities, right? Until this time, there was no other framework of education. The first Protestant universities arose in 1550 through 1575. Many of the founding of those Protestant universities was both by Protestant religious figures and at the same time who had gotten together with Enlightenment philosophers. They kind of had a common bond in the forming of a new educational system to oppose the old Catholic dominated system. Of course, Catholic universities still existed. Before 1600, there was virtually no public education. People were illiterate unless you were wealthy, had a special situation, or you were a priest who moved up and became educated in Latin in the Catholic Church. Right? So the common people did not read. They were not even supposed to read the Bible. They're supposed to be religious, but they were not supposed to read the Bible. The Bible would be interpreted by the authorities, the priests and others. You'll see this led to a lot of difficulty. When Protestantism arose, one of the key ideas of Protestantism was that people should read the Bible themselves. And this was an affront to the Catholic Church, right? To their authority, because the church should interpret the Bible, not individuals. What do we as individuals know about interpreting Scripture, right? So no public education, no public services for the most part. There were services for orphans and others, but these were rather small and restricted to Catholic institutions, right? Not public, no institutions for the general public good. Even religious institutions for the poor were scarce. There were no public banks. You couldn't go put money anywhere. There was, no public services of this kind. The place and value before 1600 of the individual was determined by their situation in a fairly rigid class system, determined by paternal lineage, right? So nobility, the king, the nobles, the knights, they also had guilds. So if you were, your father made horse, saddles, then you had a certain authority in society because you belonged to the guild of the saddle makers, and your place and when you went to the local authority and said someone has stolen from me, the first question would be, well, who are you? Should I care? Well, I'm a member of the saddle guild. Well, who stole from you? Well, where are they? Are they a noble? Are they above you? Are they below you? Well, then we might do something. If they're below you, but if they're above you, well, tough, right? So your place and your rights in society were determined by a kind of systematic structure that existed at the time. And who your father was would largely determine who you were, unless you took one of a very few paths to get out of that. Social mobility was dependent generally on, well, if you became a priest, you could go up through the church, right? From poor to pope, right? Not entirely, but sometimes. And if you were a scholar of some kind, right? Or if you were a warrior, right? If you won honor in battles, you could move up the public ladder. So the political history of these times, if you go back and some of you read the political history, or you look through YouTube, some videos about the political history before 1600 and through 1600, you'll see it's essentially a bunch of families not getting along, right? The noble families are what political authority is based upon. The idea is somehow, in some form, these noble families deserve by right of birth to be in power. And so all the political stories are about the intrigues of one brother killing another brother, one brother giving his other brother part of Italy, and then his brother in Italy isn't happy with that small part of Italy and comes back and tries to kill him, or two families that are out of alliance with each other, and they marry a daughter over and try to create alliances. This is how political. Imagine a world in which this is what your political fate as a human being depends upon, is families at war with one another and these kinds of alliances. Nothing here is about human rights or about the right of people to be governed well or anything of that nature. Whether your local prince or king served you was really up to their own, ideas, right? Whether they thought that was the right thing to do or not. From 1600 until 1650, all Europe was mired in religious wars. This was more powerfully the case in Germany, perhaps, than elsewhere, what we call modern Germany. But it held throughout England and France and Germany. This is the war, of course, between Protestantism and Catholicism, right? And millions of people died. In some areas, there were as many as 75% of the population died in these wars between 1600 and 1650, particularly in Germany. And of course, following in war, you have plague and famine. And there's a famous anecdote of someone at the time saying that after what was called the 30 Years' War in Germany at the time, that there was little left in Germany than corpses and prostitutes, right? It's what soldiers leave behind. That's what was left. So this is important to think about, because when you're reading these texts, think about people who are trying to respond to devastation, to instability, right? England was ravaged by civil wars, Germany was ravaged by religious wars, and so on. And trying to come up with a new idea, right? Whatever is there now has fallen apart. The power of the Catholic Church, this kind of structure, has fallen away, and people have to make for themselves. They have to come up with new ideas about how everything should be run. And so that's what's kind of on the table in a lot of these texts that you'll be reading. In another issue we often don't think about, but from 1650 to 1630, there was a large outbreak of what you'd call religious superstition. This is in the chaos of religious wars. You have both people terribly frightened, right? Their lives being torn apart, and you have religious instability, because these are religious wars. These are between different doctrines. So there come up all kinds of new ways of trying to think about religion, and the reaction to that was to create almost new kinds of superstition. So witches, you've heard of witches. These were not things that people worried too much about in the medieval period. But at the beginning of the 1600s, there suddenly appeared manuals for how to identify witches and what the signs were, and what you should do with them, and all the various kinds of witches. You can see these books printed. They're on, if you look on Google Books, you'll find some of the first ones. You can look at them. And the idea there, well, one of the things that early modern thinkers that we're going to read, some of the things they were doing on the side was trying to fight this through science, right? To not say they're witches, but that they have psychological problems, right? Reduce what was superstition to scientific theory. So the founder of what's called the German Enlightenment, Christian Thomasius, one of his most famous, we don't talk about it much now today, but during the period, one of his most famous kind of victories was fought to get rid of certain laws relating to witches in Germany. So this is another thing that science, this kind of science of the Enlightenment of the modern period is also fighting in the background. It's not just fighting Orthodox religion. It's fighting these superstitions that have arisen. Right? So that was a major issue in Europe at the time. And as I say here, this continued even up till 1750. So this is something that people you are reading are actively working against. And perhaps in that time they've counted maybe double this, but a conservative estimate is maybe 50,000 executions of people for not heresies, not for having wrong religious views, but for having supernatural powers or whatnot, right? Being in league with the devil, things like this. So intellectually, let's switch to talking about Europe in 1600 intellectually. I already said that the schools, the universities were more or less all Catholic, but within that Catholic tradition, you would have priests learning more or less a framework of science, which included biology and physics and astronomy and all these things, and philosophy. These were all more or less taught through the works of Aristotle, insofar as it had been modified and adjusted using Catholic doctrine. So the medieval church had created a kind of fusion of Aristotle, this ancient Greek philosopher, right, pre-Christian, with the Christian doctrine found in the Bible, and they corrected Aristotle where they needed to. And this was the official teaching. If you went to study physics, you would study Aristotle. And Aristotle was often referred to as the philosopher, right? He was the one. You had the church fathers, and they would be referred to as the church fathers, but of philosophers, it was Aristotle. He was the philosopher. He laid down the true philosophical doctrine. At this time, intellectually, people, if you study medieval philosophy up until about 1600, people are not identified primarily by where they're from. You might study certain medieval thinkers, philosophers, and never know where they were from, where they were born, because they circulated within the church, and they were in places like the Sorbonne or at Oxford, and they were sent there based on their specific tasks assigned by the church or by their specific group. And they did not think of themselves as French philosophers, as English philosophers, as German philosophers. When you get to the modern period that we're going to be reading, people identify themselves primarily as French philosophers, as English philosophers, as German philosophers, and they talk about each other in that way. Well, I don't really agree with David Hume, Kant would say. He's an English philosopher, They think in a certain way. This is something from much later, once you've developed identities. At this time, around 1600, everything is done in the same language, not German, French, or English. It's done in Latin. And so this is part of that pan-European Catholic tradition, right? And that would be the framework for anyone working in science, philosophy, and so on, aside from some important but otherwise marginal figures. There were no state-funded institutions of science. Science was not, when we look at the Catholic tradition, there are important people within the history of science, but science was not a priority. And when it was taken as a priority, it was by one individual who saw science as a way of perhaps glorifying God by studying his creation. Right? So science was a further tool of spiritual study and enhancement for oneself. So there were no institutions of science. There were no journals. There was no way to publish a scientific discovery. Right? You would write it in a book that might be copied by hand and so on. This was so much the case that even in the early modern period, when we get to people like Descartes and others you will read, their first instinct is not to share their findings, it's to hide them, right? To keep them as personal property, not to use them to benefit and to help other people. But this is one of the turns we see between 1600 and 1830. By 1830, science is, for the most part, done for the sake of the benefit of humankind, right? It's impossible to do science later, 200 years later, without publishing it, right? Whereas in 1600, the primary way of doing it would be doing it without publishing it necessarily, right? And of course, this changes. Copernicus, for instance, his work in 1543, around that same period, is one of the earliest works to try to contrary to some of the church's teachings, publish new scientific theories, right, for the good of all people. So the Royal Academies, which what I mean is what were the first scientific bodies, public bodies. The Royal Society of Britain was created in 1660, the French Academy in 1666, and the Prussian Academy of Sciences in 1700. Right? Those are the first creation, and you'll read Francis Bacon in this course. One of his key ideas is that science needs to be funded by public institutions. That's why it's the Royal Society. That basically is the triumph of Bacon, right? And when the Royal Society published its proceedings, there was a bust of Bacon on the first page, right? To show he was the creator of this idea, right? As I said, no journals, no ways of publishing research, no ways of peer reviewing research. This is for us, for all of you. If you go into science, you have to get your work peer reviewed, right? It's built into the structure of science itself for us today, that we share it, that it's a social endeavor, that it requires institutions and publications and interactions. And this is a creation of the modern period. Okay, I'm not going to go into that. Of course, another aspect of life before 1600, most people were not literate, so of course there were no dictionaries, there were no encyclopedias available. There were some kinds of works like this that existed within the Catholic Church, but you couldn't get access to them as a normal person, right? And they would be kept. I don't know if any of you have read The Name of the Rose, but in there you have great examples of the way libraries were kept, and you had to have special access, even among priests, to have access to certain kinds of books. There was no Wikipedia. There was no way for you to verify, study, understand, try to come to grips with your world through gaining any kind of knowledge. There was no possibility for the common, regular human being, right? Hence, encyclopedias, this idea of sharing wealth among all people is an ideal created in this period after 1600. I'll talk a little bit about D'Alembert and the encyclopedia in a moment, the first creation of such an encyclopedia. More kind of in terms of everyday human beings, you in Europe, if you were not a priest, you would not speak Latin. You would speak some local dialect. You would have your own folk stories, maybe some of your own, slightly offbeat religious views that would be somehow fused in your local region with Catholic ideas, right? And these were throwbacks to an older traditions in Europe that went way back thousands of years. But those things were more or less the opposition to the Catholic tradition and the Catholic intellectual world that was found throughout Europe. Your local languages, these were not things that people valued. Your local stories were not things that people would study. With many of us, we think of ourselves uniquely as defined by where we are, by the stories we grew up with, by the languages we speak. This is the exact opposite of what you would have found in 1600 or before, right? At least the way you should think and the way you should be. So, said all philosophy, good poetry, except for the exceptions, which we now look at and wonder at, Dante, Rabelais, others, early Cervantes, early examples of people writing in their local languages. We now hold them up as great heroes of modernity, even though some of them predate modernity by quite a bit, because they put value on these kinds of things, right? But before 1600, the official view would not be to value any of these things. Creativity, individuality, all those things that you're taught in advertisements today are the most important things in your lives. These would not only not be valued at the time, but they would be devalued. They would be a reason for you to disappear from the earth at some point because you tried to be individualistic, you tried to have your own ideas. I'll say something a little more later about a figure called Giordano Bruno, who this is exactly his whole life was about being unique and individual. And of course, he didn't meet with a good end, right? The idea of freedom of thought, creativity, having imagination, these things were the opposite. They destabilized the world. The church didn't seek being creative. If you creatively interpret the Bible, this was not what they were looking for, right? So it's orthodoxy. Okay. I pretty much said all of that. So I've anticipated pretty much what I'm going to say here. In Europe in 1830, you can imagine that if you were dropped into 1550 or 1600, you would be dropped into a world that in Europe that you would not recognize today, right? Everything would shock you. Life would be, you would think it was horrible. There is nothing that you value in your life today would you find there, right? You probably would not survive. But if you were dropped in 1830 or 1840 or 1850, sure, there would be things that would greatly shock you, but they would be more or less the kinds of things that you're familiar with now. But what would shock you is how much more simple they are and so on. Right? You would recognize there are Germans, there are French, there are English, there's a value placed on creativity, there is value placed on local languages and poetry, there are dictionaries and encyclopedias, and as a common individual, you can have social mobility, right? There are banks, there are universities that are not dominated by religion, their local religion. There are nation states, right? There are more or less stable. I mean, this is not entirely true. Italy, for instance, if you looked at that map very closely, half of it was Spain, and it was some other stuff. Italy didn't exist until the 1860s. 1861 is when it was unified. So still in 1830, you'd be a little surprised by some things. But things would be on the path to where you see them today, right? You would see people would take it almost for granted that that political authority is based somehow in the rights of the people, not by kings, right? There are still kings around, but their situation is not so good, and it's going to quickly deteriorate over the middle of the 19th century. If you went into to study, you would not be studying Latin. Latin has disappeared. You study philosophy, you would not, unless you're a Catholic, be studying Aristotle at all. Most people would study a bit of Aristotle. He would just be another philosopher, not the philosopher, right? Antiquated, more or less, Aristotle would be by that time. Many nations at this time have actual constitutions, right? That draw up outline human rights, things that cannot be taken from you by anyone, no matter their authority, and have some sense of equality among human beings. What your political destiny is and so on absolutely shouldn't be determined by your place in the social hierarchy, right? Another thing that you have that you didn't have before is that you have all of these disciplines in the universities. These didn't exist in 1600. You couldn't go to the university and study psychology or economics or physics in the modern sense, right? You couldn't study physics. You could study physics as part of some other program, but not physics. You couldn't study aesthetics, right? Art theory. There would be no such place. All of these disciplines that you study here at the university were created during this period, and they would all exist in the universities in 1830. But anthropology, the study of the human being, did not exist in 1600, but now exists as one of the central studies in universities in 1830. You would, of course, see all of these scientific institutions created, a vast body of institutions, journals, and so on, circulating scientific knowledge. And with the idea that it should be open and available to all people, right? So in summary, the period you're going to study in this course witnessed an almost complete transformation in the way people lived in Europe and how they understood almost everything, how they understood themselves, how they understood their fellow human beings, how they understood the universe in which they lived. For them, this transformation was an incredibly complex and contentious struggle, the ultimate outcome of which they were rarely able to anticipate. You'll see in this course many attempts to think about what the future will be like. If you read, so for instance, in the next section, if you read Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, you get a vision there of a scientific utopia. So what science could maybe lead us towards, and it's crazy, right? Bacon, although he's trying to give a foundation to early modern science had no idea what the future would look like, right? So people then, they were fighting this battle, but they couldn't really anticipate what was going to come. Now for us, this period, studying this period, for you, for me, it poses a challenge to our imagination, just like all courses in CVSP do. They challenge us to kind of try to understand the complexity of what was going on and to not take for granted all the things that we now have that were the result of these struggles, right? We must first recognize that many of the achievements of the modern period are, as I said, second nature to us. You can't imagine a world in which these things were not taken for granted. We must strain to understand a world in which these things were not second nature, in which they were in fact undesirable, forbidden, or perhaps even undreamt of. Finally, with the new eyes that we kind of gain by doing this, by reading these texts, by studying these texts, we must attempt to follow the authors we will be reading both critically and systematically to try to understand something about the genesis of the worldview we have today, right? So, I don't know if you have any questions, but that's the end of the first section of my lecture. No? I've lulled you all to sleep? Yeah, probably. 42. Okay. So, the remainder of my lecture is composed of 3 themes. I'm not going to get through those themes. I never do get through those themes, but I kind of pick each time which theme I will go into. And the remainder of my discussion of the themes is available to you from the instructor or on the website or through the CVSP website, as are all my slides here. So what I don't get through, I invite you to have a look at. Right? Now, the theme that I'm going to talk about this time is the idea of a system. This really is an idea that pervades all of the texts. And you should always ask yourself about this theme when you're going through the reader. To what extent does this author, what is a system for this author? Does this author assume there's a system? I'll tell you, every single author in here assumes that the world is a system, right? What's the system like and how does it? And it starts with Copernicus. And I'm going to take you into this a little bit, this theme of a system. So this is a picture of, it was a picture. This is a picture of D'Alembert and a quote from D'Alembert. He wrote, and this is, he is a famous physicist and one of the co-founders of the French Encyclopedia. My mouse is going nuts there. Okay, sorry about that. He wrote in the middle of the 18th century, quote, "Our century is a century of philosophy par excellence." And when you're done with this course, you'll realize what he meant by that. There's a lot of philosophy. Even the literature is deeply philosophical. It's all about ideas, right? And it's about thinking hard about ideas and about thinking those ideas and their many connections and so on. When he wrote that, of course, he did not mean that everyone in France at the time in the Paris cafes were all reading Plato or something like that. What he meant was that, rather, to understand what he meant, you have to recognize that by philosophy was generally identified in D'Alembert's time with rigorous and systematic thinking, scientific thinking about anything. So all science, physics, chemistry, mathematics, logic, astronomy, fell under the general heading of philosophy. I know that might be a surprise to some of you, but that's the way the term was used. And that philosophical thinking was understood as demonstrated and systematically connected knowledge. So what D'Alembert was noting in his statement was thus really the explosion of systematic and scientific investigations into subjects that had never been before treated in such a rigorous and scientific way. What had happened by his time was that the model of scientific thought presented in the works like those of Copernicus, who you will read in this course, had been almost completely generalized, that method, so that it was now thought to describe the one correct model of all thinking and to be applicable in every possible domain of inquiry. There was now, at D'Alembert's time, in development a science or theory of the mind, what we call psychology, of beauty, what we now call aesthetics, of politics, what we now call political science, of human nature, which we call anthropology, of money and exchange, economics, of even random events, the science of probability was created during his time, of language, linguistics, and so on. And what made all of this possible, and for thinkers like D'Alembert made this inevitable, was the nearly universal assumption that a rational system underpins everything in much the same way as a simple set of laws underpins and explains the motions of the planets in the sky. In short, all domains of inquiry can and must be made scientific, D'Alembert was thinking at the time. That is, they must be demonstrated in scientific bodies of knowledge because the world itself is a system. In the world there exists completely general laws, and under which one can subsume and from which one can deduce all the special laws and circumstances with geometrical precision. So there was this movement of generalizing. This was the assumption. You could generalize the method of Copernicus to all areas, even beauty, poetry, everything, right? Because the world itself truly is a system. Of course, how would you systemize beauty? You would root it in maybe psychology, things like this. Right? So this widespread belief in that the world is a system was in fact something quite new at the time, although it recalls an ancient Greek tradition. But this requires a bit of explanation because the medieval vision of the world was also quite systematic. The key point is that the medieval system, the system that would have dominated before 1600, and the modern system of the world are almost completely different in their structures and in their implications for the way human beings understood themselves. So here is a depiction of more or less the Aristotelian cosmological view. The Earth is at the center. You have the planets and the sun and the fixed stars. This was based on a fusion of Aristotle and the Catholic doctrine. The Earth is at the center. Everything is composed of concentric spheres. The final sphere is the fixed stars. There's nothing outside of it. All the spheres are moved and drawn along by the motion of the fixed stars that rotates. The universe, according to this model, was, by our standards, incredibly small. Right? It's a very small, you would feel claustrophobic today, this little universe. Everything is tidy, everything is ordered. And important in terms of physics, you'll see this in Copernicus. Before Copernicus, physics is divided into two branches. Physics that describes stuff under the moon, sublunarary. Their physics is different. All things move in straight lines, for instance. Heavy stuff, Earth goes down, fire goes up, right? That's that physics. And then above the moon, the superlunarary, there was a different physics where the matter that everything was made of was different, some fifth element, and that matter had the natural motion of rotation, right? So you didn't have to explain the rotation of the planets because the planets were made of material that was natural to rotate, right? You didn't have to explain the rising of hot air because it was natural for hot air to rise, right? It was when those things didn't happen. They always happened above the moon, but below the moon sometimes air goes down, and you had to explain that because some human being has taken nature and made it do something contrary to its nature, right? It's called violent motion. This was the medieval cosmological view. Now, this physical picture, it's nice, it's tidy, it's based on Aristotle, but the most important thing is it was accompanied by a religious view, a Christian doctrine. And just as this picture, it's very hierarchical. The Earth is where everything changes. It's the lower region. It's where heavy stuff goes. And in the outer parts, these are more eternal. They are unchanging. The moon, things above the moon never change. They're like God. They're heavenly, right? There is a value system involved in this physical system, superimposed on this physical system, right, by Christian doctrine. So just as this picture is highly hierarchical, both structurally and in terms of the value of things within it, their relation to perfection, their relative perfection, so the medieval world, the world people lived in, was equally, as you remember, ordered, structures, hierarchical, politically, religiously, and intellectually, right? Just as you had the fixed stars, you had Aristotle as the highest of philosophers, right? Wherever just as the universe and everything within it had a natural place and limit, so also the teachings of the church basically set out the purpose and goal of human life. This was essentially to become pleasing to God through the service of the church, which often understood us to require a turning away from the world and a renouncing of the bodily or physical things. This fit quite well into the Aristotelian model in the sense that there too, although at the center, the earth is actually the furthest from perfection. It is where all the heavy, changeable, corruptible things, the things that die, that's where they all accumulate, right? If you think about it, this might strike you as surprising. Often we tend to think that the Earth-centered model, right, of the previous period put the human being in a special place. But this is only partly true. The human being was deemed special in the medieval worldview in the sense that it was the focus of God's cosmic drama between good and evil, so to say, but it was also seen as occupying the lowest and least good of the places in the physical world. To become closer to God, one had to fight one's way towards the more perfect things, the things furthest from ourselves, from the earth, from the bodily, through prayer and contemplation. You'll see this even in the Copernicus text. It's a very early text, a transitional text. He talks about astronomy as making us closer to God because it studies the higher things. So even though he is the beginning of this new tradition, he still is calling back to that old tradition. In contrast with this, the modern conception of system was the object and child not of religion, but of science. Rather than motivating one to turn away from the world, belief in such a system provided a seeming guarantee of the success of our scientific investigations into nature. I'm going to end in just 1 minute, so give me 1 minute. So what was this system initially thought to be like, and what did it mean to thinkers and writers of this period? In our reading for this week, we can see what it meant for two thinkers of the period, Giordano Bruno and Alexander Pope. Let me tell you just a little bit about the first one, right? So I'm just going to actually end with this quotation. So Bruno, I'm going to say something about him a little bit. So Bruno, this is one of the, I'm saying this because when you get to your reading, you'll get plenty on Copernicus, and you'll get Bruno, there's just a small section there with not a lot of explanation, and then you'll read this long poem by Alexander Pope. So I wanted to give you a little bit of context here. So Bruno himself was a follower of Copernicus. He was a Dominican monk who kind of fled all over Europe, teaching this new system of the modern world, right? He traveled through France, Switzerland, England, Austria. He was finally captured in Rome, imprisoned, and tortured for almost a decade, and he was burned in 1600. Bruno's interesting because in the Italian tradition, he is still taken as kind of today. There is this statue here in the Campo dei Fiori where he was burned. He is the kind of the patron saint, you might say, of Roman students. Every February 17th, people gather in this square to praise his doctrine because they saw his new system, his new scientific system, as focused on and as motivating not the old value system of the church, but rather a world in which the championed independence of thought, religious freedom, tolerance, freedom of speech, not the devaluation of human physical life, but the valuation of that life, right? Of equality of all beings and a kind of universal humanism. So, and here's a quote that kind of illustrates, this is from your reading, this kind of view that he preached. So he went off preaching this Copernican scientific worldview, right? But he tried to draw humanistic, everyday lessons from it. And so he says, this is just one of our many things he says, our reason, after the Copernican revolution, he says, our reason is no longer imprisoned by the fetters, the chains, of those 8, 9, or 10 imaginary mobiles or movers, those spheres in the crystalline world, right? We're no longer imprisoned by that. We know that there is nothing but one sky, one immense ethereal region, where those magnificent lights, the stars and planets, keep their proper distances in order to participate in perpetual life. So we are led to discover the infinite effect of the infinite cause. The infinite effect is the infinite universe. It's not that small, enclosed, spherical universe. It's now an infinite universe, which is the effect of an infinite God that says, well, loves all things. The true and living sign of infinite vigor. And we have knowledge and we have the knowledge not to search for divinity removed from us if we have it near. We are not in the worst part of the universe. We are, because the universe is infinite, because we are now among the stars, right? There is no up and no down. He still believed in God, of course. He believed that, therefore, we are as close as anything else, right? So we don't have to seek divinity outside of ourselves. It is within us more than we ourselves are. In the same way, the inhabitants of other worlds must not search for divinity in our world, for they have it close at hand within themselves. Since the moon is no more heaven for us than we for the moon. And in the text you're reading, he uses this kind of idea of mutual respect and valuation of ourselves and others to reflect particularly on things like Columbus and people in North America, extending this idea that their place is of equal value and should be protected, as should our own. So thank you for that. That. Yeah, sure, thanks.